Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second installment in Street Grace's anti-demand webinar series. This one is towards a comprehensive anti-demand policy. And what we're aiming at here today is providing all of you in attendance with helpful insights and strategies to help coordinate and improve your state's anti-demand response. Joining me today will be Kamala Zolfagari with Street Grace and Sarah Benson from Shared Hope, both premier policy experts. Before we get started, I want to first thank our webinar series co-sponsors, the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, or NCOSE, thanks NCOSE, and Global Emancipation Network. We thank you both so much for supporting this work and contributing as well. Thank you. Also, we're going to have a very brief Q&A session after both Kamala and Sarah present. So if you have questions, just type them in below for them. We're not going to have a lot of time. And so if we don't get to your questions, every presenter, including myself, has included their email at the end of the presentation, and we all welcome follow-up questions. So if we don't cover something you really needed covered, please feel free to shoot any one of us an email, and we'll get right back with you. Also, we'll be launching the third installment of this series in March. The next one is going to be dealing with the illicit massage industry, or the IMI. So please keep an eye on our social media for updates on that. And also, if you're attending today, you're going to get an invitation to the next free webinar without doing anything. It'll just show up in your email. So with that out of the way, let's get started. A little bit of background on me. I'm the Director of Policy, Anti-Demand and Policy at Street Grace, and I've been with Street Grace since April of this year. And before that, I served for 7 years as Senior Staff Attorney at Children at Risk. And it was in that role where the majority of the events that I'm going to be talking about took place. And by events, I mean the work and the advocacy efforts that went into getting Texas to its current status as the first and only state to have felony penalties for first-time sex buying. Street Grace is deeply and passionately committed to ending demand, and we want to replicate these efforts in all the states we work in and get all of them up to state jail felony and all 50 states beyond that. So let's get started. I'm going to switch over to my PowerPoint real quick. Okay, so what are we going to be talking about today? Or what am I going to be talking to you about? Increasing buyer penalties, one state's journey. That state, of course, being Texas. And journey is the correct word, or odyssey might even be better. It was 7 years of incremental work that finally led to Texas's current status as the only state to have criminalized sex buying to the felony level. So what were we dealing with back in 2014? We were dealing with a global prostitution statute. And that's one of the first things you should look at in your state is, does our state's prostitution statute distinguish between buying sex and being prostituted, right? Or is the offense all in one? And that bifurcation, it's a fancy word for a split in two, can be two separate statutes where you have one, say, a prostitution statute and a solicitation statute or pandering statute, or it can be bifurcated within the statute itself. And back in 2014, Texas was the most global statute you can imagine. And at the beginning, it seems okay. We split it out into offers to engage or solicits another. But shortly after that is language saying that it doesn't matter if you pay a fee or receive a fee. It didn't matter if you hired someone or they hired you. It's all prostitution. They go out of their way, or they went out of their way to make this as global as possible. And that made sense back in the day. They weren't particularly concerned about who was doing what. They charged them with prostitution. They wanted to make sure no one could wiggle out in any way. And that was the goal. And it lines up well with the kind of anti-prostitution policing that was being done back then, which was essentially street level enforcement, trying to clean up areas, particularly when homeowners or business districts complained, right? So the statute worked for Texas's purposes for a very, very long time, but we know a lot more now. So how did this kind of get started in Texas? Well, it started as a simple quest for data back in 2014. I was actually heading up two projects in Texas. One was demand abolition. They ran the CEASE network. I know some people on the call are going to remember this. It was a network of cities. And if you joined, we were doing Houston and Dallas. If you joined, you worked with demand abolition to implement various programs. And the goal was to reduce demand by 20% in your city. And to quantify that, well, we needed to know how many buyer arrests were being were being accomplished every year in Texas, right? We were also doing a project for the Texas Bar Foundation that was very much on the nose. We were actually looking at demand as an issue in Texas. And as part of that, a big part of that project was actually quantifying how many buyers were being arrested versus how many prostituted individuals were being arrested. But this data simply did not exist. It didn't exist in any form, any usable form. Why? Because prostitution arrests weren't distinguished. It was a global statute. Whether you were buying sex or selling sex, did not matter. You were going to be arrested with, charged with the crime of prostitution. And so we thought, well, can we break it out by gender? Can we say that all the females who are arrested are going to be prostitute individuals and all the males are going to be sex buyers? No, that didn't work either. And in large urban areas, like Houston, for example, as many as 20% of arrests of a year, prostitution arrests for prostituting, for selling sex, they can be of men. So you can't just break it out by gender lines either. And so we were left in a situation where we didn't have any data. Well, at the time, HPD, who was a CEASE member, a founding CEASE member, started voluntarily collecting this data. So their officers started splitting it out in their reports for us. So we would know how many buyer arrests versus how many prostitute individual arrests were being done going forward in Houston. In the meantime, we made two decisions. One, we were going to try to bifurcate Texas's statute, and we were going to use data as the entry point for doing that. And the second thing we did was send out a lot of public information requests. In fact, we sent them out to every county in Texas and every police department in Texas. And once we got all that data back and started running through it, we found that Texas arrested a little over 10 prostitute individuals for every one buyer, or to put it another way, a little less than 10% of yearly prostitution arrests were of sex buyers. All the rest were prostitute individuals. Now, a little Texas trivia before I start getting into the nuts and bolts and the excitement of the 85th legislative session. Texas only has session once every other year, right? So it's an every other year thing on odd numbered years. The year in between sessions is used for studying issues. So as you can imagine, every state's legislative session is a whirlwind, right? Imagine backing that up where you're trying to get 2 years of bills passed, in a 4-month period once every 2 years. That's very, very difficult. So it's a maelstrom in Texas, and it's busy everywhere, but I think we're a little bit unique. And the last thing I want to say is the Texas Human Trafficking Prevention Task Force is a task force that's headed up by the Attorney General of the state of Texas. They do a lot, but one of their main tasks is they collect legislative recommendations for all the task force members, and there's hundreds of task force members. They compile those, they vet them, and they come out with their own legislative package, which is carried by a legislator during the session. All right, so what were we talking about in 2015 when we were first broaching this? And our prostitution statute, by the way, hadn't really seriously been amended since the 1970s. Well, we were talking about the concept of anti-demand. It was the first time this had really been brought as an issue, an issue in the forefront of the Texas legislature. And this was the first time we got in there to talk to them about this. And so we were really bringing that anti-demand message, not for the first time in Texas, but certainly for the first time to this magnitude. We kept penalties in the background because our main message was data needs. We came in talking about this anti-demand concept that we can seriously reduce human trafficking by going after the buyers. And then our next, the next message that we brought was, but we don't even know how we're doing. We need to know how we're doing around the state. Say, for example, Amarillo is just doing great. It's totally made up, but say Amarillo is doing great on buyer arrests, right? Well, we need to know what they're doing in Amarillo. And the only way we can do that is we bifurcate the statute so we can actually quantify how many sex buyers are being arrested. So we really led with this data needs pitch, and very, very receptive, right? We showed right from the get-go, we're taking this seriously. We're not coming at you with a bunch of crazy amendments. We have a solid plan. And that plan is going to center around what the data shows us. Legislators really appreciate a thoughtful approach. They're thoughtful people, right? And they like to know that you know where you're going when you start presenting legislative change. We weren't strictly data, though. We also really hammered the message that these are not the same crimes. They are absolutely not. And one class is made up of victims, that we have one class that either has been or is going to be human trafficked, more than likely, according to the statistics. We have one class of people that is, driven to this by circumstance. Very, very, very few choose it without at least having past trauma in the background, if not even more dire immediate circumstances that are pushing them into this life. And the other is a moneyed, all male, skews Caucasian, predatory class of criminals that are preying on the first class. And the first step, before we said anything radical about changing that, let's acknowledge that these are two different classes, and that's the need for bifurcation as well. The data, and these are two separate classes. So before we decide to do with what the data shows us, whatever we're going to do, let's at least make this distinction so we can make the proper choices in years to come. And again, that was a well-received message. I want to say we also maintained message discipline very well. That is to say, we didn't conflate prostitution and human trafficking. They are separate crimes, and you can have prostitution without human trafficking. And we went out of our way, and our allies went out of their way to make sure that we didn't do that, that we kept on message with that. And one of the things we would say is, prostitution is not all prostitution is human trafficking. It's absolutely not. But prostitution is the market expression of human trafficking. And one way to measure and end human trafficking is by controlling prostitution by means of demand reduction. We also were keeping an eye on another House Bill 1363, which was similar to the bill that we filed, but also reduced penalties for prostitute individuals, right? Not by a lot. It more or less set it out one stage. So it's actually five convictions before you're eligible for a felony. We were keeping an eye on that as well and supported that bill. And that also informed a lot of our later decisions. However, the bill that was produced and sent to Leg Council, which is the body that prepares legislation, when it comes out of Leg Council, is ready for filing. We sent in a draft copy of a separate solicitation bill, so a separate solicitation law. So Texas would have had under this scheme a prostitution law and a solicitation law. What came out was not the original concept. And so what we had in 2015 was kind of some chaotic progress through Senate Bill 825, where what we did was we made sure that it was bifurcated in that we have receipt of a fee and we have payment of a fee. We had a section A and a section B, and law enforcement, when they made an arrest, could actually enter in, was it in subsection A or was it subsection B? So now we've got this data collection. However, the language was a little bit wonky. Not everybody was happy with it. And it was one of those situations where things are moving very, very, very fast. And the intent was always, we're going to get this amended in committee. Or get it amended in committee next time. Let's just get it moving. Let's get it through. And what happened was it never got fully amended and never got fully fixed. It was a functional bill and a functional law, and it did bifurcate the statute. However, law enforcement and prosecutors weren't thrilled with it, but that is what we had. So starting in 2015 in Texas, we had a bifurcated statute. And so in 2017, we came back and we cleaned up a little bit with House Bill 29, and that was cleaning up that language. The language was no longer wonky. It was a sort of a straightforward fix of semantics. And so while that was going on, we also made good on our promises. We had talked to legislators about what we were going to do and our plan and our thoughtful strategic plan. And we made good on the things that we said we would do, starting with House Bill 2552 brought forth by Representative Thompson. That bill specifically required data collection of all prostitution arrests in the state of Texas, broken out by buyer and prostituted individual. And what we found was actually that when this data was collected, after we were able to analyze it a year or two later, was that we were actually correct. It was 1 out of every 10, or a little more than 10 prostitution arrests in Texas were for sex buyers, with the other 90% being sellers. But we're collecting this data, and then we use that data to advocate in subsequent sessions. So, it's a thing of beauty. We pass a bill to collect, saying we want to collect data, we pass a bill to collect the data, and then now we have this data that we can now use to advocate. And that was our strategy from the very beginning, bite-sized chunks. No one in Texas was ready in 2015 or even in 2017 to hear a message about dramatically increasing buyer penalties. And I feel like I should go back and talk about House Bill 2552, House Bill 1363, which would have lowered the seller penalties. That was actually vetoed by Governor Abbott. I don't know if I mentioned that, but that very much informed our later strategy as well. So we're trying to come forward in incremental steps or bite-sized chunks, and we're going to continue our anti-demand education in the interim. And of course, it wasn't just us. There were tons of groups in Texas who were thoroughly anti-demand, steeped in this, understood it, believe it, and were preaching it at the Capitol. So they're receiving this message, and lots of interim work. And so we did lots of work going into 2019. We mapped the locations of illicit massage businesses and made an anti-demand argument around that. We brought research to the Capitol. We worked on analyzing the data that was being collected so we could present that as well. So all through the interim, we are there making office visits, testifying in committee hearings, bringing this anti-demand legislation. And in the summer of that year, we submitted the first, what we call the Texas model, to the Attorney General's task force as a legislative recommendation. So originally, the Texas model that we proposed had mandatory probation for buyers as a trade-off for felony penalties. So what we said was state jail penalty for all buyers. We were worried that legislators would take that, would think that was a little too harsh. And so what our trade-off was, well, just like we do for Schedule 4 narcotics, on your first offense, it's still a felony, but we're going to do mandatory probation. So you're not going to go to jail, right? So we thought that might sweeten it a little bit for them. The Attorney General's task force took this and they said, you know what would be better? State jail felony for buyers on the first offense and mandatory probation for prostitute individuals on the first offense and the fourth offense, which was a brilliant idea conceived of by Kirsten Melton and made the statute so much stronger, so much more comprehensive, and so much better. But we lost state jail felony before we even filed. I got a courtesy call, saying, we've talked the office, we've been talking, and we don't think that we can get state jail felony. We're going to move it up to Class A misdemeanor. So going into 2019, we knew state jail felony for buyers was off the table, but we were still 1,000% behind this for the increase in penalty to a Class A on the first offense, state jail felony on the second offense. So that puts us in the upper echelon of states right there. And of course, the fantastic idea of offering prostitute individuals mandatory probation and mandatory diversion court on the first offense and on the fourth offense. So it's still a felony for them on the fourth offense, but they're not going to county, they're going back to diversion court, which is a big deal. Normally in Texas, you get one bite at the diversion court apple, and that is it. And I was so pleased that, though, however, how well received this was and how well received the higher penalties were. And I didn't mention this before, but in the 2016 interim, I actually had a legislator ask me a question in live testimony, live committee testimony during the interim, which was being videoed and available to all Texans to watch. Are you telling me, he said, that you really want a guy who says he's been working offshore for 2 weeks and he comes home and he's been working hard and sure he goes to a prostitute. You telling me that guy needs to go to jail? So this legislator, who I'm not going to name, felt comfortable enough in 2016 to ask that in an open hearing, right? That's no longer the case today. And so to reiterate, in 2019, the bill successfully passed and we raised penalties to a Class A misdemeanor on the first offense, state jail felony for all subsequent offenses for sex buyers. Okay, so what were our takeaways coming out of 2019? Well, working with agencies comes with a price, and that's pretty self-evident, right? We work with the task force, and as advocates, we don't have a lot of control over the bills anyway, right? We're just kind of on the sidelines cheering. We were actually drafting legislation, putting it out there. And of course, we testify and we do as much as we can in the background to move the legislation forward, but we're not in control of it. And with the little control that we do have, we sacrifice when we work with, say, the Attorney General's task force. On the flip side, though, it comes with the imprimatur of the task force, right? This is what the state wants. And so you have a much higher likelihood of passing. So you lose a little bit of control you have. I didn't have a voice in whether or not we went to Class A or state jail felony for buyers. I was told, and that's understandable, right? They're steering the ship now, but understand that that's the price you pay. Was it worth it? Of course. But I do it again? Absolutely. We also knew coming out of 2019, the demand message was reaching legislators. There were some fears that, we couldn't come back asking for more next session. We wanted to come back and say, hey, a state jail felony, would they be receptive to that? Or would they say, look, we just gave y'all a state jail felony on the second offense in Class A. What more do you want? We're still there at the Capitol. We're leading with demand in all of our human trafficking conversations, whether we're talking about the illicit massage industry, whether we're talking about survivor services, whether we're talking about youth prevention. Demand is a part of all of those conversations. So they always know that without the buyers, this problem would not exist in the magnitude that it does. So 2021, again, we submitted state jail felony to the AG's task force going into the 2021 legislative session. We were not the only group to do that. A bunch of people submitted this. And what we came out of the task force had a huge appetite for it in 2021, and so did the legislature. And the bill, which is House Bill 2795, again carried by Representative Thompson, created the separate offense of solicitation of prostitution, which is now in Texas Penal Code 43021. So we didn't just bifurcate, we created two separate laws. Now we have a prostitution law, which is 4302, and a solicitation of prostitution law, which is 43021. And here it is, a person commits the offense. A person knowingly offers or agrees to pay a fee to another person for the purpose of engaging in sexual conduct with that person or another. And that is a state jail felony. And so what were we talking about to get this passed? I kind of did the thing where, here's the idea, and look, it's passed. Well, there was a lot to do. One, here's some of the key arguments that we were bringing to the table and other allies were bringing to the table to make this argument for state jail felony on the first offense, which is a big leap and a big change in the way people see this, right? One of the big things that we brought forward was, law enforcement incentivization and prosecutor incentivization and capitalization. And by that, I mean capitalizing on law enforcement's work. Law enforcement is going to, they're directed by the city in a lot of cases, so their priorities are going to be set for them, but the state also plays a big role in that. When you increase the penalties for something, you are telling law enforcement, this is important to the people of Texas, pay attention to it. And so by increasing it to a state jail felony, you're automatically going to have more buyer arrests. Texas and Dallas, they arrested 110 buyers in a sting operation not long ago. And the police chief in Dallas said, the legislator has told us they think this is important. And by the way, it's great to be a police chief and get 110 felonies in one operation, right? So it's incentivizing across the board. Prosecutor incentivization. Again, in a major urban area, you're going to have a line of violent felonies out the door. For a Class B misdemeanor, with a buyer who's going to skew Caucasian, he's going to skew wealthy, at least wealthier than a prostitute individual, who's going to lawyer up. When that lawyer shows up in your office as a prosecutor, it's a Class B misdemeanor and you have felonies out the door. Of course, you're going to make that deal. Of course, you're going to take that deal. And that's what was happening. Buyers were pleading out and pleading down, which directly impacts law enforcement incentivization, right? Why would I go out and arrest a bunch of buyers if I know they're all going to get pled down or pled out, right? But now we're telling prosecutors, this is important, and we've made it a felony. That's how you move up as a prosecutor, is by prosecuting felonies. Well, here it is. Here's a new felony, and they're going to be, we're going to have a lot of them, and you're going to be able to prosecute a lot of these felonies. We made the argument around youth deterrence. And by that, I mean, what are we telling the next generation that is coming up when they can see IMBs on the corner and street prostitution rampant, and they can go online and see just tons and tons of online sex ads. I mean, prostitution is everywhere and no buyers are getting arrested. We're grooming another generation of buyers. We're saying, yeah, maybe we say this isn't okay, but we don't treat it like it's not okay. Well, now we know it's not okay. It's a state jail felony. We take this seriously. We talked constantly about the trafficking market triangle, and I'm assuming everyone here on this call knows what it is, but there's many ways of doing this. We had a simple illustration with the triangle, showing on one corner to illustrate the sex trafficking market. On one, we had the facilitators or distributors, and those are pimps. On one corner, we had the supply, which in this case is people, it's victims. And on the other corner of the triangle, you have your consumer base, in this case, sex buyers, right? If you remove any corner of that triangle, the market will collapse. Well, historically, we've tried for a long time to reduce human trafficking by arresting victims. That hasn't done anything, right? They're fungible, they're replaceable, there's an endless supply. It does nothing. While we should be doing everything we can to arrest pimps and traffickers, we're never going to arrest our way out of the problem that way. They choose this criminal life for a reason. It's low risk. Victim testimony can be hard to come by. We'll never arrest enough pimps to end human trafficking. But the consumers, the buyers, the ones who are fueling this market with their money, they're culpable, they're catchable, and they're deterrable. And if we can eliminate that corner, we can severely reduce the amount of human trafficking. Along with that, we talk about buyer demographics and victim demographics. Buyer demographics are very favorable for higher penalties because of their wealth, because of they skew Caucasian, because they're all men. These are not favored groups, right? And so it's easy to show how this privileged group, and they are a privileged group, is preying on the most vulnerable group. And with victim demographics, where you have majority people of color, where you have a number of transgender individuals caught up in this, where you have certainly elements of poverty and drug abuse feeding into this, we can start talking about that predatory relationship that exists between buyer and prostitute individual, and why buyers needs to be disincentivized. We do a lot of data analysis. We could show that all of our efforts around Texas, statewide, outside of Houston and a few other outlying areas or outliers, were majority arresting prostitute individuals, and why we needed to change the perception in law enforcement's mind and prosecutors' mind about who really needed to be punished for this crime. And we changed the perception of the conduct, right? This predatory relationship. So some of our key allies, our biggest allies, law enforcement, especially those who get it, those who want to do more, those who understand the problem that human trafficking is and understand the fundamental role demand plays in human trafficking, our best advocates. If they want it, it certainly works. It certainly helps to have them there and have them in favor of it, because legislators listen to them, right? And survivors cannot say enough about having willing survivors there to talk about the importance of demand reduction. The survivor voice is the most important voice, and having them there, those who are willing and able to talk about what demand really means and what it meant to them during their exploitation, was priceless. If you have bioremediation programs in your state, whether those are maybe a church is running one, we have several in Texas, right? They got behind this and they testified. Prosecutors, a key ally for us. Schools in areas that are affected by street prostitution, don't overlook that you can have allies in the schools as well. We had a vice principal who had to go to her school every morning at 5 a.m. to clean up the needles and condoms that were left behind in the wake of street prostitution. The same thing with business districts, the same thing with city and local leaders. These can be key allies to lift their voices, let their voices be heard in raising demand. So our final takeaways. You want to determine the state of your current statute in your state. Is it bifurcated? Is it not? What do the penalties look like? Remember, incremental gains are still gains. We played the long game and we won. And was it frustrating? Was it difficult? Was it hard to wait? Yes, it was, but we got there. And I think that everyone who's in a state where this still needs to be done, you're at a significant advantage compared to us, because we were starting kind of at ground zero in Texas with the anti-demand message. Not ground zero, but really it had not truly gained traction there. So we had a lot of ground to make up, and so did a lot of other folks, right? In your state, it's unlikely that demand is at least an unknown concept. I would say maintain messaging and message discipline. Choose your legislative champion wisely. You may have a freshman senator or a freshman representative there may be no one on earth more passionate about raising penalties and who gets this issue more, but that may not be the right person to shepherd your bill through committee and to get it passed, right? Know the political landscape. Know who the lobbying groups are, particularly for law enforcement and prosecutors. You want to contact them and you want to get them on board early. You want to know anyone who's going to be opposed to this. No one is pro-human trafficking, but some people are more libertarian or in their political views may not see prostitution as a problem or may not understand the connection. These are people you need to educate, right? And you want to know the counter arguments to decriminalization. People are going to be talking about, no, this should be this should not be a crime whatsoever. You need to know how to talk about that. And we actually revisit the webinar we did a couple of months ago on decriminalization. We talk a lot about how to counter those arguments. So know that and know the arguments to decriminalizing demand. We made a lot of this will center around, also money may come up, budgetary issues are always in the minds of all legislators in every state, in every session. And if you start raising it to state jail felony, what is that going to look like for the states? There's going to be a fiscal note attached to that, right? Ways to counter that are, you're going to be decreasing the amount of prostitute individual arrests, you're going to be increasing the amount of buyer arrests, know how many buyers your state is arresting, so you can at least minimize the amount in their mind that this is going to cost. And you need to also have arguments talking about how much the illegal sex industry costs the state every year, how this is going to offset so much more in policing, so much more in victim services, so much more in anti-trafficking measures. Money will be saved in the long run. And then, boys will be boys, family men. You don't hear this a lot in other criminal context. No one's saying, well, sure, he was a drug dealer, but he had kids and he was a wife and he went to church. No one says this, right? Sex buying is the only time this kind of comes up. Like all of a sudden, oh, I want to punish this guy. He's a family man. And, boys will be boys. We don't do this for any other criminal class. And it's important that people understand that what we're talking about is not a harmless preoccupation. It's not a harmless hobby. This is directly harming people and putting people at risk. This is preying on the most vulnerable. It is not something a family man does. And if this guy is exemplary in all of his other conduct, well, he needs to be punished for this. This rises to that felony level of conduct. And so I hope this has been helpful for you. This is my contact information, Jamie Carruthers, jamie@streetgrace.org. We're not doing a Q&A for me, so if you do have follow-up questions for me, shoot me an email. I promise I'm more than happy to talk to you, and I promise I will respond. And so next up, we're going to have Kamala Zulfagari. I'm going to stop sharing real quick and tell you about Kamala. Kamala serves as the executive director of Street Grace Georgia. She brings 10 years of expertise and experience prosecuting human trafficking cases and spearheading legislative changes. During her time at Street Grace, Kamala has overseen the passage of some of the most historic legislative victories in the history of the human trafficking movement. In 2014, Kamala was appointed to be the first special prosecutor dedicated to the prosecution of human trafficking in the state of Georgia. In addition to handling prosecutions, Kamala oversaw the Attorney General's policy agenda on human trafficking. Prior to that, she was head of the Human Trafficking Unit for the Fulton County District Attorney's Office. She obtained her Juris Doctorate from the University of North Carolina and her LLM in International Law from the University of Amsterdam. And with that, without any further ado, please welcome Kamala Zulfagari.
Thank you so much, Jamie. And thank you all for joining us today to talk about policies to end the demand that fuels the commercial sexual exploitation of our children. And we're going to talk about the progress that has been made, and in this case, particularly in the state of Georgia as an example, and of how legislators' minds can be changed, people's minds can be changed, and how important it is to go after the demand that fuels the trafficking of our children. Talk a little bit about where we were at a starting point for Georgia when we went after demand. First of all, so important when you're talking about the buyers that fuel trafficking, lack of knowledge of age cannot be a defense, particularly for buyers who sometimes are doing great harm to our children and are purchasing them for only 15 minutes. We should not have to prove knowledge of age. Lack of knowledge of age cannot be a defense. We also had a great framework always of having separate laws and separate treatments for pimping, pandering, and prostitution. For sellers, those who are selling the body of another. For panderers, those who are purchasing the body of another. And then prostitution for those being sold. And all along, our prostitution laws have been our very lowest level of misdemeanors, no enhancements, recognizing always in some ways, this is somebody who's being exploited. And our trafficking laws have also always, since they were first created in 2007 and then strengthened in 2011, included buyers under that word obtains. So obtains, most of our trafficking laws follow that federal model where it's talking about recruiting, enticing, transporting, maintaining, and obtaining for the purchase of sexual servitude. It was actually some of our federal counterparts that first started prosecuting, particularly in the Midwest, South Dakota, for example, buyers of children under that obtaining for the purpose of sexual servitude. And our first prosecution in Georgia was a case that happened in 2013, that the trial happened in 2014, the prosecution of this buyer for trafficking right alongside of those who were selling these two girls. But how we got there was first when we said we have to have human trafficking training, official human trafficking training for our law enforcement, for our prosecutors, right there in that very first, this is the definition of trafficking, this is the statute, actually bolding the word obtains and saying that those who are purchasing our children, the demand is they're traffickers, just like the sellers who are treating our children like commodities. Buyers, sellers, the same through that word obtains. And then nonprofits and researchers really started training, talking to law enforcement prosecutors about you have to go after the demand. The demand is what is fueling the trafficking. So in this case, two 14-year-old girls were recovered with two of these traditional, always been prosecuted traffickers, the person who had recruited and enticed and transported, the person who had posted online and had said how much to charge. But an FBI agent, in this case, Joe Fonseca, decided to take it one step further. And at that time, I was actually the state prosecutor for human trafficking in Fulton County. So we were able to prosecute these buyers together. And he used multiple methods of interviews, records, phone records, housing records, Secretary of State records, to identify actually multiple people who had purchased these children, trafficked these children for the 2 and 3 weeks that they were on the run, that they were being exploited. And there was one who we were able to identify, the final one, who was actually purchased these children when they were with the two seller traffickers that we'd already identified. And he absolutely fit the model of what we had seen. They said he's saved in our phone as 80 because that's how much he was supposed to pay us, even though he brought us $79 in a cola. And he fit the model of what all the research said also. Not that had he not, it wouldn't have been the same offense, but he was a family man. He was a business owner. He lived north of the perimeter, which is where our more affluent areas are. And we were able to go in and prosecute in the same indictment this buyer for trafficking just alongside of the sellers who were maintaining these two girls. And you do live and learn continually. Our plan had been, well, we're going to go back and charge all the buyers later. At the time that first trial was concluded, these survivors were in no place to go through this, and all efforts, all resources, all focus needed to be on helping them recover. It's part of that victim center process. But again, live and learn. I would have done it all together at the same time had I known. But our trafficking laws, and after this prosecution and after the federal prosecutions, first Congress added the word solicits or patronizes, right there with obtains, right there with recruits, right there with entices for the purpose of sexual servitude. Following federal model, we first proposed doing this with the legislature in the first year. That was a 2015 year, and I'll talk about that again later when we're talking about our pimping and pandering laws. So last time I heard a senator say, why are we going after these buyers? I mean, they're just purchasing sex. This isn't part of trafficking. You know, I hadn't heard that in the general community when we've been constantly out teaching and training for years, but there still was this very antiquated idea of buyers are just these anonymous non-entities, not recognizing that they are the demand that fuels the commercial sexual exploitation of the children. They are the ones hands-on harming our children. And so finally, it took about 5 years. First, solicits and patronizes were added, but then for the first time, they actually lowered the penalties for the solicits and the patronizing. When we're using obtains, penalty was just the same as buyers, sellers penalized the same. Like, okay, we'll give it to you, but we're going to really mess up the sentencing structure, leave some holes in it, and make sure these people are not punished the same as the seller traffickers. Actually, we had a meeting with all of the other policy nonprofits, in Street Grace, and actually consider pulling our support for it. But what we found in policy, so many of us have found, is you just need to keep getting on the board and every year strengthening your law and improving it, not forsaking the base hit because you didn't get a home run. So we finally got solicits and patronizes. Then we were able to actually equalize that penalty, making sure that buyers and sellers were punished the same, and another year. And we were able to add, what's really key when you're going after buyers, is whether you're soliciting a child for the purpose of commercial sex, or you're soliciting someone you believe is a child, but is really an undercover officer, you should be punished the same. We do not want our policies to say we actually need to harm that child before we can stop you from doing it. When you are soliciting, when you are trying to harm that child, it's part of our whole prevention model. Prevent the child from being harmed and allow our law enforcement to have the teeth that they need in order to stop those before they exploit our children. And when it comes, so trafficking, prosecute buyers, go after demand under our trafficking laws, but we also still have pimping, pandering, and prostitution laws to go after. So pandering, the demand, it had early on, decades and decades ago, been made that highest of misdemeanors. And in 2001 is when we said, you know what, you can't purchase children can't consent to this. Under 18, if you purchase a child for sex, that's got to be a felony. It's a 5 to 20-year felony, which actually in Georgia isn't our highest penalties. 2011, that's when a trafficking law really got some teeth. We also said, you know what, for those who not only can't consent to commercial sex, but can't consent to sex, under 16, we're going to add extra teeth, up that penalty to 10 to 30 years. And then 2019, leapfrog that again, we got to, you know what, it doesn't matter when you can consent to sex when we're talking about commercial sex. So for those 16, 17-year-olds, again, the penalty is 10 to 30 years. And then there's that issue that we're talking about, the demand that includes the buying of adults. And in this case, adults who believe, who hold themselves out to and believe that they are there willingly. Really started going after that in 2015. And it was that same year that there was so much pressure to the point of it could not get out of the second committee. Flew through the first penalty, upped what we were asking for, made things more serious. But second committee on the Senate side could not get that through. So no, we're not. Why are we going after buyers? A lot of education happened. Finally, a few years later, we got, okay, at least we're going to make sure they get 24 hours in jail, something more. And then in 2019, and it very much was in this case, listening to law enforcement. A law enforcement officer sat down with the state rep and said, this is using up all of our resources. We do these major operations to go after and try to recover children who are being trafficked. And all of our resources are being after the same repeat offenders, buyers, sellers, over and over and over again. They're just making sure the person's 19 years old, making sure the person won't talk, making sure they won't cooperate. And it's using up our resources. And when she sat down before the committee, some of these same legislators who refused to do anything for years and years, when it wasn't so much moved by this is part of the commercial sexual exploitation of children in the same scheme, when it was basically being mocked by exploiters, by people who are saying, hey, I don't really care about your punishment. Fine, you can say it's wrong. No big deal. I'm making plenty of money. I don't mind getting an arrest. I'll be bonded right out. Total cost of doing business. The whole mood, the whole thing changed. They gave us, in this case, the second time. So your second offense of buying or selling, pimping or pandering, still protecting those being sold as the lowest level misdemeanor. They made that a felony. There was a lot of backroom talk about making the first time a felony, and actually our pimping and pandering laws are so broad and so easy to prove. They were afraid of the accidental pimp. I didn't mean to. When I told the person to go to this certain place in Vegas, I didn't realize that would be pimping. Now, I think that was pretty ridiculous, but we didn't want to take their offer of we'll just increase, we'll increase, we'll make it harder to prove pimping. We're real happy with that. So dealing with the repeat offenders, making it a felony. And it was from the legislators' own minds that went, you know what? You can hide where you are from your wife for 24 hours, but you can't hide for 72 hours. So even for those first offenses of buying or selling, an adult who believes they are willing, that's going to be 72 hours in jail. You do it again, it's a felony. So Really, thank you so much. It's really great to be on here with these panelists talking about how we can go after that demand that fuels trafficking. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kamala, for that incredible presentation. It's always great to hear about how other states are getting there and what they're getting done. And of course, Georgia has made an incredible amount of progress in a very short time. And I know a lot of that, is down to you and other advocates like you, which brings me to my first question. How much of this was driven by, advocates, not only other nonprofits, right, who are in the anti-trafficking space, but also individuals. We've got a lot of individuals who are listening today, and they want to know, how big is my impact? And so what did that look like in Georgia?
So it was really key and crucial in finally getting us to the stage where people would recognize demand as trafficking and how important it was to go after it, because that senator never actually changed his mind, but this groundswell from the advocates and from individuals and from the general public pushing for going after the demand that fuels trafficking led to actually one of his fellow senators and a very good friend of ours advising him, hey, you need to just not attend the committee meeting. If you can't vote for this, if you can't recognize that we need to go after buyers, you just need to skip this vote. And indeed, that's actually what happened. And it's because while he did not want to punish buyers, he also could not stand up against the advocates and the public that was following, that was wanting to go after and make this difference, make this change.
Law enforcement also sounds like they were a big kind of tipping factor in this. Once the legislature heard from law enforcement, they were like, okay, well, this is what we kind of need to do. I've seen that kind of effect in a lot of different states. How important was law enforcement's buy-in on this? And what do you think really kind of got law enforcement to say, yes, higher penalties for buyers is the answer?
Right. Law enforcement is key. And part of it was originally just going to law enforcement and saying, hey, what's most important? What do you most need to see changed? You're the people on the ground, not policy people. And this was one of the things they identified as, even back in 2015, we've got to do something about these repeat offenders. They're using our resources. On the other hand, in 2019, when it was actually an officer in there testifying, and it was an officer who knew what was important, knew to some of these people, it was just the waste of resources, or it was that absolutely maddening, hey, we don't really care about your punishment. We don't care what you say. We don't mind it. That really moved that needle, that really changed it. Just like our policies are always survivor-led and law enforcement-led, we go to the real experts, those who are on the ground.
Great answer. And my final question for you is, what's next in Georgia? What's the next frontier in anti-demand in Georgia?
Well, so absolutely two things. We want to make sure buying is a felony the first time. You should not be able to take advantage of the vulnerability of another one and purchase another person's body for sex. But one key way of getting there is we've got to work on our training. So I said back in 2011, we said state has to create training. The legislation says you have to create training, but we have never mandated that anyone actually receive that training. And while in certain areas, we have pockets where lots of people have been trained, and there are so many cases in those areas, but we still have pockets of the state where people have not been trained to identify trafficking and to recognize, particularly in trafficking, the importance of going after demand. So we have to make sure that importance of demand is part of our training, and that training is mandated for our law enforcement, for our prosecutors, for those who are charged with protecting our children.
Well said, and I could not agree more. Thank you so much for being with us this morning and talking about it, how Georgia got where it is and what's next. And we appreciate all that you do.
Thanks. It's great to have everyone here, and I'm excited to hear from everyone else, and keep listening.
Next up, we have Sarah Benson Jeju from Shared Hope. A little bit about Sarah. Sarah joined Shared Hope in 2016 to support the organization's state legislative advocacy work and state report card project. Sarah focuses her advocacy efforts and research on strengthening states' statutory and practice-based responses to child sex trafficking, striving to support the design, passage, and implementation of survivor-centered legislation. In her role as Director of State Legislative Advocacy, Sarah provides technical assistance, subject matter expertise, and bill drafting support to state legislators, survivors, ally NGOs, and advocates. Prior to joining Shared Hope, Sarah worked for several child protection and women's rights NGOs in Kenya, in Senegal, Zambia, and in the US, advocating for stronger legal protections and responses for survivors of all forms of sexual and gender-based violence. Sarah earned her undergraduate degree from Webster University and her law degree from DePaul College of Law. With no further ado, please welcome Sarah Benson-Jeju.
Thank you so much, Jamie. And really, it's an honor to be here and to participate in this conversation. It's one that I know many folks are having in the field and we're having internally at Shared Hope. And so I'm grateful to be here. For a brief bit of background before I dive into how Shared Hope defines anti-demand efforts, and particularly how those anti-demand efforts are included within our legislative framework. For just a brief bit of background, Shared Hope has been examining anti-trafficking responses through the lens of state statute since 2011, when we launched the Protected Innocence Challenge project. And many of you may be familiar with the Protected Innocence Challenge project, more commonly termed the Report Card Project, because we release state report cards from this. But this is really the bread and butter of our state policy work, and really served as a foundation for our advocacy positions from 2011 and 2019. This project, there was 41 components, or within the framework of the project, there were 41 components that really examined a comprehensive response to trafficking. 10 of those components were centered specifically on anti-demand responses. So ensuring that buyers of sex with children were treated as trafficking offenders, that there were CSEC laws to address the wide variety of criminal conduct that buyers engaged in, and that there were really impactful penalties being applied to buyers following a conviction or plea of guilt. And we saw enormous growth in this particular area of law since 2011, in which we first started grading states. When we first began to grade states in 2011, a majority of the states were really at the F&D range across all areas of law, including anti-demand responses. And by the time we finished grading states in 2019, looking just at those 10 anti-demand policy goals under the framework, the national average was 83%. It was around this time that we really began, though, to uncover the fact that there was disparities in legislative growth across the country. And this largely was due to the fact that states were struggling to put forward really strong pieces of legislation that centered on victim protections, including non-criminal responses, access to services and justice and care. And because of that, Shared Hope embarked on a 2.5-year process to really do a deep dive in that disparity. Why was the national average in 2019 84.7%? If we looked just at the victim protection section of the framework, we were hovering just at that low C. And in most states, we are more in the D range. It also forced us to begin to contemplate what an A grade meant. We were seeing a number of states receiving an A grade, and yet what we were hearing from the field and what we were seeing in statute was really an emphasis on mechanisms to hold offenders, traffickers, buyers, facilitators criminally accountable, while there was less legislative emphasis or prioritization on access to funded services for children and youth, on equipping agencies and organizations with the tools and funding they needed to deliver a really strong response to children and youth who had been identified. And as a result of that, we embarked on a 2.5-year process to really uncover that disparate growth, to really understand where the growth was taking place, where a lack of change really existed, and how we as an organization could begin to mobilize around ensuring that our laws are really centered on survivors and on the need for quality victim protections in place. And so we released a number of reports and projects during that time that really began to examine the impact of law, how were non-criminal protections supporting survivors, how are the lack of non-criminal protections or safe harbor laws negatively impacting not just survivors, but all stakeholder groups, how were state trafficking laws being misapplied to hold victim offenders, or oftentimes what are called bottoms, accountable for the crimes of their offenders. We really relied on the technical assistance and feedback that we were able to receive through our technical assistance from the field on the challenges in putting forward really strong victim protections. And then we engaged in a research to action process, which we're incredibly grateful to Street Grace for their contribution to that work too, which really led to the development of a new framework in which all anti-trafficking responses, anti-demand responses, anti-trafficker responses, anti-facilitator responses, and survivor-centered victim protection responses really were centered around the well-being of survivors, and really seeking to push state lawmakers and policymakers to focus their legislative efforts on where the most growth was needed, and to focus their work on ensuring that anti-trafficking legislation really contemplated the impact on survivors. And because of that, our new framework, as compared to the framework that we've utilized since 2011, a majority of our new framework, which we released in 2020 and began grading states this past year, a majority of that is really focused in on victim protections because that's where the most growth is needed. We also began to really examine how each of the responses of an general anti-trafficking response can work together to support the well-being of survivors. And so when we were looking at an anti-demand response, how can that anti-demand response positively impact the trajectory of children and youth with lived experience? How can the response provided to traffickers and facilitators elevate those same goals? And because of that, our new framework really across all sections, across all policy components and goals, really do come back to examining how our statutory responses to trafficking can really positively shape and support the goals and the wishes and desires and the best interests of survivors. And so we were forced as an organization, as a policy team, to really redefine what an anti-demand response looked like when we put survivors and survivor well-being at the center of that. And it forced us to rethink what accountability meant. What does meaningful accountability mean? How can criminal and civil accountability benefit survivors? How are we ensuring that we don't have these bifurcated responses in which justice for offenders means one thing, but justice for survivors means something different? How can we align justice to really center on the well-being of survivors? We really had to ensure that as we were seeking accountability for offenders in law, that there were related protections in place to prevent re-traumatization, particularly when we were looking at the role of survivors serving as victim witnesses, and were there in every state comprehensive protections to really support that survivor in that role. We had to ensure that as we were looking at accountability and identification of offenders, that there was that safety net in place to be able to support survivors, because we know that when we're investigating and identifying offenders, we're going to be investigating or we're going to be identifying survivors. And so what is that response waiting for a survivor once an identification of victimization is made or a suspicion of victimization is made? We are also forced or really encouraged to redefine what success means. And when I think about specifically what anti-demand, what success means in terms of an anti-demand response or initiative, it's one that doesn't compromise the short or long-term well-being of survivors, and that really is centered on achieving justice, achieving long-term safety and care for survivors. Oops. And so what does that mean in terms of specific policies? When we look at the portion of the framework that still is examining criminal justice responses for offenders, we really began to think about accountability through the eyes of justice for survivors. And so ensuring that all of our mechanisms or our statutory goals really supported the long-term effort to identify and appropriately respond to kids with lived experience. So ensuring that our trafficking laws contemplate the numerous forms of exploitation that oftentimes kids who are trafficking victims don't have a third-party controller or a trafficker, but that buyer is that core offender. And so ensuring that there isn't a barrier to both holding the offender accountable, but there isn't a barrier to identifying and providing an appropriate response to that child who does, rise to the definition of sex trafficking victim. Again, we have to ensure that our accountability mechanisms, our punitive measures against offenders, positively impact survivors, that state law requires that courts order restitution in cases of trafficking, that fines and fees and penalties are directed towards victim services funds. That was a piece of feedback that we heard time and time again, that service providers are just not adequately funded to be able to provide the level of care that's so necessary and that survivors deserve upon the finding of victimization. And that there are opportunities for survivors to seek civil liability against their offenders. We also had to contemplate whether there was that second piece, whether there were quality survivor services in place, whether those services were funded. How are we identifying survivors? What happens after we identify survivors? Included in that are whether or not there are comprehensive non-criminalization or safe harbor protections in place. Again, when we're making that finding of offender, we're going to make a finding of victimization as well. And so how is that survivor or that victim of a crime being treated? Are they being directed to a punitive route? Or are they being directed to a child-centered protective route outside of a punitive juvenile justice or criminal justice system? How are stakeholders who are interacting with that child, how are they trained or equipped to provide that quality survivor-centered response, one that's trauma-informed? And then we had to ensure that we know that in order to have a successful conviction or to reach that plea of guilt for offenders, that oftentimes survivors are playing a really critical role as a victim witness in that case. And yet what we're hearing from survivors and the feedback that we received is that was oftentimes at their expense, that they experienced a lot of trauma along the way serving as a victim witness. And to us, that isn't justice. That's not a successful anti-demand response when we're compromising the emotional, physical, and psychological well-being and health of a survivor in order to secure that conviction or to make, to hold offenders accountable. And so we have to ensure that there are really strong, comprehensive, and accessible protections available to survivors participating as victim witnesses in cases against their offenders. And importantly, that those protections are extended to all children and youth, that they aren't available just to younger children, which we do tend to see a distinction there, where closed circuit television or CCTV testimonial opportunities are available, but they're available for really young kids. And so we need to ensure that state law expands opportunities for accessing courtroom protections, really a child-friendly courtroom or a victim advocate to walk along the process with them, that's available to older youth too. In terms of promising practices, we're beginning to really hear from criminal justice stakeholders how helpful and impactful the opportunity to present evidence through a hearsay exception is. That is a way to present evidence while still meeting constitutional requirements and without traumatizing a victim, or that accounts for the role that trauma plays and potentially compromising consistent testimony. And so all of these together are policies that we believe can support criminal accountability, particularly for buyers, while also ensuring that survivors remain at the heart of that work. So in terms of marrying these like hypothetical policies or these theoretical policies with practice, when we think of the application of these statutory laws or these statutory protections, I think, what I was able to do is separate them out into 3 categories. What is the impact in the investigation, the prosecution, and that ultimate application or pursuit of justice, or really the accountability mechanism against that offender. And so when we walk through the sting operations, I think what would be helpful is for stakeholders to be contemplating how these laws will be playing out. So as law enforcement are designing sting operations, it's really critical to be considering whether or not the state has that safe harbor or that non-criminalization protection in place. And if not, what will the outcome be for that child? If they identify a child engaged in commercial sex with a buyer, will that child be arrested and prosecuted for the crime of prostitution after that identification is made? What are alternative responses that should be in place to really identify and protect that child? Are there funded and age and culturally appropriate services that law enforcement can refer the child to? We're increasingly hearing from the field that law enforcement are almost reticent to make identification of victimization among children because there's nothing. They have nothing to turn to. They have no place to refer these kids to. And so because of that, they're almost forced to utilize criminal justice processes to preserve the safety and to be able to direct the child to something. And so we have to ensure that as we are implementing anti-demand responses, that there are quality safety nets and services in place for child and youth survivors. And then when we walk through the prosecution, we have to, forecast out that as we're beginning to contemplate the use of a survivor in the criminal justice proceedings against their offenders, are there comprehensive victim witness protections in place that are accessible and meaningful to that survivor? Is there a victim advocate available who can walk alongside that child as they're participating in the process, who can ascertain whether or not harm is occurring, whether the minor is being re-traumatized, and how survivors can tap into other opportunities to receive protection and care through that process? And have all stakeholders received trauma-informed training? Have we ensured that our prosecutors understand the role that trauma plays in a survivor's ability to serve as a victim witness, and how traumatizing the criminal justice system and processes can be as a whole? And what are ways that we can mitigate as a field the impact of that? And then ultimately, when we look at accountability, is the state law require that restitution is ordered? Are there opportunities for a survivor to positively benefit from accountability that's applied against his or her offender? Do fines and fees, are those directed to Victim Services Fund? And if so, what proportion of the fine or fee are being directed to victim services? And again, can survivors seek civil liability against their offenders? What is the process in place for that? Have statute of limitations been eliminated or at a minimum extended to account for the time it takes to understand one's own exploitation and to safely be able to initiate the process in which they're seeking accountability against their offender? And I know I've talked a lot about redefining success and ensuring that our collective efforts are really premised on the well-being of survivors. And this is a definition that Rachel Lloyd, who's a survivor and founder of GEMS in New York and the author of Girls Like Us, uses for her own definition of success, or what she hopes to see among the young people that she serves and works with. And while this is just one definition, I sometimes think that if in our individual roles and in the pursuit of our individual goals, we're turning to a definition like this or akin to this to ensure that our collective efforts are ultimately benefiting survivors, I think we will achieve survivor-centered responses, survivor-centered anti-demand responses that, while we're seeking accountability and preventing accountability against offenders and preventing additional harm, at the heart of that is really a focus on how that impacts the trajectory of those with lived experience. And so, it's something that as an organization, we will continue to turn to, that definition of success, and that we really hope the field to gravitate towards in current and future anti-trafficking endeavors. So I'm happy to stick around for questions if anyone has any. I'm also going to share my contact info. Please feel free to reach out via email if you have any additional questions that may come up at a future time. And thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Sarah. That was so great. I think we've got so much information to process here, and we've got a lot of questions too, so I'm going to get straight to it. One of the questions concerns civil accountability. You mentioned that a couple of times. Can you kind of give us some policy examples about that, or some best practices or promising practices that Shared Hope has seen around the nation with respect to civil accountability for buyers or in the demand context?
Yeah, great question. I think there's two really critical components to that. There's the legislative barriers, the statutory barriers that prevent survivors from seeking civil liability, civil claims against their offenders, particularly buyers. And then there's also the practical barriers that exist. So to the former, some trafficking laws still do not allow or don't contemplate the ability for survivors to bring a civil claim against their offenders, or they allow for civil liability against traffickers but not buyers, or business entities who are operating as facilitators but not buyers. And so ensuring that door is open, that survivors who are able and who are interested and willing to seek a civil claim against their offenders, that there's a mechanism for doing so. Importantly, that needs to happen under the trafficking law, but that also needs to occur through a variety of other offenses, CSEC offenses, so that if the conduct of their offender doesn't reach to the level of a trafficking offense, that there's other opportunities for a survivor to seek a civil claim. I think the second piece to that, though, and one of the largest barriers that we see is the lack of availability of quality legal services for survivors. And I want to give a nod to the Avery Center and their Legal Deserts report, which really illuminated the fact that even in states in which there are laws that allow for survivors to bring civil claims against their offenders, who's going to take that case? What survivor is equipped with the support and the resources that they need to bring that case, to walk through a really daunting process. And so some of this is policy, sometimes some of this practice, and we hope to see almost a marrying of the two, that we can't solve everything through legislation, right? But there are opportunities for the legislature to ensure, one, that a roadblock to bringing a claim is eliminated, but two, that there's funding opportunities in place for survivors to be able to seek out and to receive really quality trauma-informed legal services, so that survivors who are interested in participating in a civil case against their offender are really equipped with the appropriate people and the resources to be able to do so.
That's a great answer. And I think that is so true. A lot of the work that we do collectively is, removing these roadblocks. The legislation can't do everything, but we can make things possible for people. All right, final question real quick. Obviously, the report cards came out. You were a huge part of that. I think I can speak for everyone, or I'm going to speak for everyone and say we're also grateful to see this come out with these new rubrics and these new standards. It really puts trafficking back on the forefront. Since you just finished that, what kind of was one in this context, in the anti-demand context, probably what was the most surprising thing you saw compiling those report cards and all that data?
Yeah, there were a lot of surprises. I have to say I'm surprised that you even said you're grateful, because we delivered a lot of F grades this year. So I appreciate your words, Jamie. That surprises me. But, in terms of outcomes from our statutory research, one of the most surprising pieces that we uncovered was there's a collective agreement in the field that training plays such a huge role in identifying cases, identifying survivors, and most importantly, delivering a really appropriate response, particularly for those with lived experience. And yet state law doesn't reflect that kind of agreement that we have in the field, or that common recognition of the critical role that training plays. And so that was an area of law that we saw some of the biggest gaps in. Our previous framework examined just training requirements specific to law enforcement. Our new framework that we are utilizing examines training requirements specific to child welfare, caseworkers and supervisors, law enforcement, juvenile justice stakeholders, school personnel, as well as prevention education, prosecutors, and prevention education for students. And when we look at what training exists across stakeholder groups, it's minimal, it's bare. And where it does exist, it's almost a check the box statutory mandate. So something that's vague that either says law enforcement shall be required to receive training. It may just exist at the academy level, but it may not be a continuing education requirement across stakeholder groups. Or problematically, there isn't funding attached to that. And so what we're hearing from those who are impacted by training requirements, whether that be child welfare caseworkers or child welfare agencies or law enforcement, is that the legislature is requiring this training mandate, but they aren't supporting that through the appropriations to ensure that quality training is provided too, and that they can bring in the necessary experts to ensure that their stakeholder groups and participants are able to receive that training. And so, that's an area of law that we really hope to see an increase in. We know that we believe every element of our framework is really important and complements the other components. But if we have stakeholder groups, if we have stakeholders who are screening kids, who are in a position to connect them with services, but they themselves are not trained on what an appropriate response looks like, we're going to be hard pressed to see really impactful growth in practice until that happens. And so we're hopeful. There seems to be stakeholder buy-in. And so now I think it's important for us all to be educating our legislators on the need for quality and funded training mandates across stakeholder groups.
Thanks, Sarah. I couldn't agree more. The importance of training really can't be overstated. Thank you so much for being with us today. And I want to reiterate, we are so grateful for all that y'all have done. Keeping trafficking in the forefront, our movement has to be reality-based. Our movement has to be truth-based if we're going to make real progress. And so Shared Hope is keeping it real for everybody. And so we appreciate it. Thanks so much, Sarah.
Oh, thank you, Jamie, and the Street Grace team. I'm so grateful too.
And that concludes our policy webinar for today. I want to thank everyone so much for joining us. And before you go, we're going to have a QR code come up on the screen here in just a few minutes. If you scan that, please, that will link to a survey about today's webinar. We really would appreciate it if you take just a couple of minutes to fill that out. It really helps us. It informs what you liked about the webinar, what you didn't like, what you'd like to see in the future. So please just take a couple of minutes and fill out that survey. Not last, but I also want to thank our co-sponsors again, the National Center on Sexual Exploitation and Global Emancipation Network for their support of this webinar series. Thank you guys so much. And last, I want to reiterate that please, if we didn't get a chance to address your question, or in my case, any question at all, please feel free to send an email. Our addresses were in the presentation, and I'm more than happy to follow up, particularly on anything anyone may have a question about. So again, thank you all so much for being here today, and I look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Take care.